Of all the obsolescent aircraft in service with the warring nations at the start of the Second World War, the Gloster Gladiator stands out majestically as the pinnacle of a past generation's perfection. Perhaps that is why a responsibility far exceeding its theoretical capabilities fell upon its wings. Aggressive nations possessing considerable resources could afford to experiment. In contrast, British Strategic Command, finding itself less prepared, was forced to use whatever defensive means were at hand. The irony was that the Gladiator, despite being obsolete compared to other machines, became increasingly important. Reliance on it grew with every week, and its numbers in service increased throughout almost the entire first year of the war. According to the political doctrines of the 20s, the Gladiator should not have appeared at all, at least not in the near future. But Churchill's so-called 10-year rule was finally discarded in 1932 along with the dissolution of the Disarmament Conference. The threat of war became real. Guided by this, as well as the fact that since 1920 home defense had been planned with possible aggression from France in mind, the Technical Planning Committee concluded that the country urgently needed short-range interceptor fighters. As early as 1930, opinions were voiced that the old fighter formula, 2 machine guns and a speed of 149 to 199 miles per hour, had to be replaced immediately. The aim of the new specification issued by the Air Ministry was an attempt to move away from the old belief that 1 man and 2 machine guns constituted a formidable weapon. The military was alarmed that the speeds of the standard fighter and its potential targets were becoming increasingly close. Moreover, the 2 Vickers machine guns, firing ammunition manufactured 20 years earlier, often failed even before opening fire. The new requirements called for a maximum speed of 249 miles per hour and an armament of no fewer than 4 forward-firing machine guns. It was envisaged that all of them would be synchronized to fire through the propeller. In addition, handling characteristics were required that would allow the fighter to operate in both day and night units. By 1932, when almost all the country's design teams were working on the new requirements, it became evident that the economic depression had been overcome. The emphasis on universal aircraft application by day and night promised large orders for whoever won this competition. In the early 1930s, RAF squadrons were equipped with Bristol Bulldog, Hawker Fury, and Demon aircraft. While the Gloster Aircraft Company was busy refining its prototype, development began on the Gauntlet aircraft, which was intended to replace the Bulldog fighter in the mid-1930s. While work on the Gauntlet prevented Gloster from preparing its contender for the 1930 requirement competition, other companies, namely Hawker, Bristol, de Havilland, and Westland, were experimenting with technical innovations that had not even been considered before. However, 2 serious obstacles stood in their way. The first was the specification's insistent requirement to use the Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine with evaporative cooling. This motor was ill-suited for fighters due to its weight and the vulnerability of the cooling system, which determined the failure of many projects. Another problem for most engineers was the requirement to position the machine gun breeches so that the pilot could access them directly during flight. The strict requirements of the new technical assignment spawned a multitude of experimental designs, yet none lived up to expectations. Neither the Westland Gullwing biplane, where the pilot sat in front of the engine, nor the Supermarine monoplane, nor the more traditional Hawker PV-3 coped with the task. Moreover, the outlines of the newest Spitfire and Hurricane monoplanes were already appearing on designers' blueprints. This threat could have put an end to the project altogether, as it seemed obsolete even before its birth. But here a problem arose. The old Bulldog biplanes were already being written off, while the new high-speed monoplanes were not yet ready for mass production. A dangerous time gap formed. At Gloster, this was understood instantly. If they took their Gauntlet aircraft and deeply modernized it, it would perfectly fill this gap and bring the company a lucrative contract. Engineers at Brockworth set about theoretical calculations. They utilized a single-bay wing cell based on Hawker technology and installed a powerful 700-horsepower radial Bristol Mercury engine. The landing gear was made aerodynamically clean by hiding the spring shock absorbers inside the wheels, and landing flaps were added to the upper and lower wings. Calculations promised excellent results, a maximum speed of 249 miles per hour, and a surprisingly low landing speed, just 48 miles per hour. Thus, thanks to a coincidence of circumstances, the Gloster Company achieved what proved beyond the power of the rest of the aviation industry. With courage and faith in success, they assembled the SS-37 prototype. Already in September, Captain Sayer took it into the sky. The aircraft, equipped with a Mercury engine and armed with 4 machine guns, 2 Vickers and 2 Lewis, accelerated to 242 miles per hour. At the Air Ministry, they initially did not believe that an aircraft with a radial engine was capable of such high performance, so they funded prolonged trials. Eventually, the prototype was handed over to the military. It was significantly improved. An even more powerful Mercury 9 engine of 840 horsepower was installed, along with 4 new Vickers machine guns and improved wheels. Events began to unfold rapidly. The Royal Air Force, needing expansion, urgently required aircraft. In just 2 weeks, the production specification was agreed upon, a contract was issued, and on June 1st, the new machine was officially named the Gladiator. Time showed how far-sighted this decision by the Gloster Company was. Europe was boiling, and turning a blind eye to it meant inevitable destruction for Britain. Mussolini had struck Abyssinia, and Hitler was openly demonstrating his military intentions. At least 2 years remained before modern monoplane fighters would enter service, and no one knew how many could be produced. So while the prototype was undergoing trials, which incidentally gifted the aircraft an enclosed cockpit canopy, mass production was already being rolled out at the Hucklecote factory. The batch was put into work simultaneously, so the order was fulfilled almost instantly. At the beginning of 1937, the military accepted the first machines, and by March, the last of this series. Immediately following them was a second, much larger batch of 180 fighters, which were to be delivered by the end of that same year. The first Gladiators went to 72 Squadron at Tangmere. In February 1937, Captain Donaldson, along with other pilots, ferried the brand-new aircraft to their new base at Church Fenton. This unit was destined to fly Gladiators longer than any other combat unit in the metropolis, right up until April 1939. Later, when deliveries were completed, 3 Squadron at Kenley also received the new machines, finally replacing their old Bulldogs. All this time, while the tense wait for the new Vickers MKV machine guns continued, and they were primarily going to arm bombers, temporary solutions had to be found. All the initial batches of aircraft were equipped with Lewis machine guns, which were mounted under the lower wing, far from the pilot. Subsequent events showed that although supplies eventually stabilized, the technical services faced a heap of problems, so the Vickers were rarely used. The situation changed only with the appearance of the license-built Browning machine guns. The old systems were turned to only as a last resort. The first unit to receive Gladiators already equipped with the brand new Brownings was 54 Squadron at Hornchurch. This happened at the end of April. Shortly after, 74 Squadron followed. But here an interesting incident occurred. This unit immediately handed over the newly received Gladiators to their neighbors in 3 Squadron and switched back to the older gauntlets themselves. Next in line for the new fighter was 80 Squadron from Henlow, which received the machines in May 1937. But since this unit was soon deployed to the Middle East, we will discuss its fate a bit later. During 1937, 65, 73, 87, and 56 squadrons also received new aircraft. However, the introduction of the Gladiator into RAF service did not pass without difficulties. Although pilots generally accepted the new fighter warmly, the training process was accompanied by numerous accidents. There were so many incidents, albeit mostly minor ones, that an additional batch of 28 aircraft had to be urgently ordered purely to replenish losses. These machines stood in storage until 1939, when they were sent by sea to the Middle East. The main piloting problems arose from increased wing loading and a lack of experience landing with large area flaps. The new biplane braked more sharply, had a tendency to drop a wing, causing damaged wingtips to become a real headache for mechanics, and relatively easily entered a flat spin, requiring considerable skill from the pilot to recover. Because of this, performing spins at night was strictly forbidden, but in the long run, the Gladiator provided immense benefit. The experienced pilots gained working with an enclosed cockpit canopy, and landing flaps proved invaluable when transitioning to the Hurricane and Spitfire. The statistics are eloquent. In squadrons that switched to monoplanes from Gladiators, there were fewer flight accidents than in those transitioning from gauntlets. By September 1939, all 8 squadrons on Gladiators had acquired fully combat-ready status. And here, traditional, albeit logic-deprived, British diplomacy came into play. the government graciously invited a group of high-ranking Luftwaffe officers for an inspection. On October 23rd, Generals Milch, Stumpf, and Udet arrived at Hornchurch to inspect 54 and 65 squadrons, the very forces that constituted the spearhead of London's air defense. The year 1938 changed priorities. The RAF's appetite for new Hurricanes was growing, but industry could barely keep up with satisfying it. A new policy was adopted. For every squadron re-equipped with the Gladiator, there was to be one switching from older types directly to the Hurricane or Spitfire. A major rotation began. 3 and 56 squadrons swapped their biplanes for monoplanes, and the released machines were transferred to other units. Moreover, understanding that with the start of a major war in Europe, overseas lines of communication would become vulnerable, command began deploying Gladiator squadrons to the Middle East to protect the Suez Canal. And as time would show, this decision was exceptionally wise. Here is the continuation of the story. I have streamlined the list of squadrons, turning dry statistics into a narrative so that the listener can more easily visualize the scale of the problem Britain faced. So while Neville Chamberlain was conducting his infamous peace negotiations that ended with the Munich Agreement, Britain's skies were still protected by biplanes. The statistics of the first line of defense looked bleak. Only 2 squadrons of the newest Hurricanes were fully staffed and combat-ready. Instead, the backbone consisted of 5 squadrons on Gladiators, 8 on Gauntlets, and 3 each on Furies and Demons. In the second line, that is, in the auxiliary forces, the situation was no better. 2. Hurricane squadrons were only forming and were not yet combat-ready, while the remaining units, equipped with Gladiators, Gauntlets, and Demons, were at various stages of rearmament. Military planners understood perfectly, for a reliable defense of Britain, at least 52 fighter squadrons were needed. The scale of the necessary expansion of the Air Force was colossal. That is why, when war finally broke out, the good old Gladiator still remained in the ranks. It simply could not afford to retire. In September 1939, at the start of the war, England's air defense relied on Hurricanes and Spitfires, as well as partially on Blenheims and Gladiators. At the same time, Spitfire squadrons were considered a kind of elite, a corps d'élite, which was carefully preserved for the enemy's decisive strike on the coast. Meanwhile, British plans provided for the allocation of fighters to cover the expeditionary force heading to France. In the haste and confusion of the first weeks of the war, the first 2 Hurricane squadrons were allocated for this. However, it soon became clear that regardless of treaty obligations, RAF forces on French territory were critically scarce. Accordingly, in November, 607 and 615 squadrons were urgently transferred from Croydon to Merville to reinforce the northern group. By the way, even before the redeployment, in October, a flight of 3 Gladiators under the command of Captain Sample claimed a victory. Over the North Sea, they shot down a Do-18 flying boat, the crew of which was rescued and taken prisoner. Many weeks passed without significant events. The severe winter shackled air activity on both sides. Numerous flight accidents were the result of poor visibility and ruined airfields. But as soon as news arrived about the start of rearming both squadrons with Hurricanes, a storm of German offensive hit Holland. All pilots of the expeditionary force instantly found themselves in the vortex of a deadly clash. After the fatal May 10th, Gladiators were in constant combat for a whole week. 607 Squadron lost the unit commander, a flight commander, and 7 more pilots. Replenishments continued to arrive, and on May 18th, approximately 18 Gladiators and 12 Hurricanes still remained combat-ready in the 2 squadrons. On this day, after a prolonged and exhausting battle over Arras against Bf-109s and Bf-110s, the surviving Gladiators landed at Vitry and Artois, where they immediately came under enemy bombing. Many fighters were destroyed right on the ground along with the supply dumps. Left without fuel and ammunition, the squadrons received orders to burn the surviving equipment and retreat to the coast for evacuation to England. The combat log of 615 Squadron did not survive in that chaos. However, records from 607 Squadron give grounds to believe that since May 10th, these 2 units destroyed 72 enemy aircraft. And since the Hurricanes flew relatively few sorties, it must be admitted, the lion's share of these aerial victories was achieved precisely by the machine guns of the obsolete Gladiators. Of the more than 50 biplanes that crossed the English Channel from October 1939 to May 1940, only a handful survived. Tired but battle-hardened pilots were pulled out of the hell of battles to be given a rest and transferred to Hurricanes and Spitfires. But the war for the Gladiator did not end there. The North awaited it. There is an opinion that British intelligence was extremely reluctant to admit its responsibility for sending obsolete biplanes into the very crucible of modern war. Perhaps that is why the contribution of these aircraft to the Norwegian campaign in those dark days of 1940 was often glossed over. But despite all political games, the feat of 263 Squadron remains one of the brightest pages in RAF history. When Hitler began the invasion of southern Norway on April 8th, the British were already preparing a response in the north. 263 Squadron from Filton, which had just been withdrawn from operational status, was initially planned to be sent to Finland. The pilots underwent special training for flying in bitter frosts, which ultimately determined their fate. They were redirected to Norway. 18 pilots, together with their machines, loaded onto the aircraft carrier Glorious. On April 22nd, the ship departed from Scapa Flow. When 149 miles still remained to the shore, the biplanes took to the sky and set a course for the frozen Lake Lesjaskog in central Norway. From the very beginning, this expedition suffered from terrible organization. The pilots were ready to meet the Luftwaffe, but their machines were not, and the ice on the lake was already beginning to melt. Despite this, the squadron had to cover Allied troops practically blindly, without any early warning system. An irony of fate, the runway right on the ice for the Royal Air Force was trampled down and cleared by 200 local peasants under the leadership of Major Whitney Straight. The morning of the first day began with problems. Carburetors froze in the frost. Yet, a pair of Gladiators managed to take off and destroyed a German He-115. However, a solitary He-111, taking advantage of the patrol being distracted, dropped bombs along the strip. The enemy had discovered the base. On April 25th, the Germans began to methodically destroy the lake. Due to a lack of ground personnel, the pilots refueled the aircraft and reloaded machine guns themselves, turning into mechanics between sorties. There were cases where pilots were wounded on the ground but rose into the sky again to defend the base or cover artillery within a radius of 10 miles. By the middle of the day, Captain Mills and Lieutenant McNamara had shot down another 2 enemy aircraft, but the price was high. 10 Gladiators burned on the ground. In the twilight, the lake resembled a graveyard of machinery. Only 4 machines remained combat-ready. The next day, they flew further north to Åndalsnes, where, left without fuel, they were finally destroyed on the ground. The squadron returned to Filton to catch its breath. Let us be frank. The Gladiator was no longer a match for modern German aircraft, but there was simply no time to retrain on Hurricanes. Norway demanded help immediately. This time, preparation went faster, and the squadron received a full team of technicians. On May 14th, 18 new Gladiators sailed again on the Glorious, this time setting a course for Narvik. Part of the wounded pilots were replaced by newcomers, but a veteran of the first expedition, Lieutenant Lydekker, voluntarily returned to duty right during the journey. On May 22nd, they arrived at Bardufoss airfield, losing 2 aircraft on the way that crashed into a mountain. Work boiled over instantly. On the first day alone, the squadron carried out 54 sorties. Lieutenant Craig Adams died ramming an He-111 bomber, and the next day, Sergeant Wall destroyed a Do-17. In the following days, the list of victories was supplemented by several machines, including heavy Ju-90, Ju-88, and He-111 aircraft, and this time, without own losses. The patrol radius expanded to 62 miles. Now Gladiators often worked in pairs with Hurricanes of 46 Squadron, the only other RAF unit in Norway. At the end of May, the tasks changed. Ground attacks were added to aerial combat. Pilots of 263 Squadron attacked railway stations, transport columns, and coastal vessels. The battles were fierce. On May 30th, Flight Lieutenant Vickery's aircraft returned from a sortie over Bjørnfjell in a terrible state. Anti-aircraft fire had torn off an interplane strut and a bracing wire, and a huge hole gaped in the upper left wing. But the Gladiator made it home. It was on this already damaged machine that at noon on June 2nd, Lieutenant Jacobsen fought his legendary battle against a large group of enemy bombers. When his wingman, Lieutenant Wilkie, was shot down, Jacobsen remained alone in the sky near Narvik. In that clash, he probably destroyed 1 Ju-88, forcing it to crash into a mountainside, confirmedly shot down 3 He-111s, this was confirmed by wreckage found, and probably a 4th Heinkel, which is listed in German documents as missing in action. The official report paints a picture of true hell. The Gladiator found itself surrounded by 2 Ju-88s and 6 He-111s. The Germans sprayed it with fire from cannons and heavy machine guns. The biplane's oil cooler was pierced, the cockpit canopy was instantly splattered with oil, and the wing bracing wires sustained damage. To avoid a collision, Jacobsen went into a dive and sharply turned onto the tail of one of the Heinkels. Firing almost blindly, he saw the enemy aircraft shake as bursts stitched through both its engines. Eventually, Jacobsen remained alone against superior enemy forces with empty ammunition belts and almost dry tanks. Only flying at extremely low altitude saved him and allowed him to return to base. Later, Norwegian sources confirmed that the remains of 3 He-111s were found near the Swedish border, which were credited to Jacobsen. We will probably never know exactly how many aircraft he destroyed in that battle, but a comparison of German reports with Allied actions gives grounds to believe that his prey became up to 6 machines. If this is so, then this is an absolute record among Allied pilots in the Second World War for one sortie. On June 7th, 46 and 263 squadrons were evacuated from Narvik. The aircraft landed on the deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. It seemed the worst was over. But the very next day, the carrier was intercepted by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The ship went to the bottom, taking with it almost the full complement of both aviation units. Among the dead were the elite pilots who showed the best results on Gladiators: Major Donaldson, Flight Lieutenants Grant Eade, Vickery, Williams, Lieutenants Falkson, Purdy, the very hero Jacobsen, McNamara, Bentley, and Sergeant Russell. Only 2 Hurricane pilots managed to be rescued from the ICC. For the Gladiator, the war in the Middle East began back in mid-1938, long before the major battles. A Flight of 80 squadron based in Palestinian Ramleh was already participating in an operation against insurgents. In the pre-war years in Egypt and Palestine, 33, 80, and 112 squadrons operated on these fighters. The latter, by the way, was formed right on board the aircraft carrier Argus during the passage to Alexandria. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the old biplane became a common sight in the skies over Malta, Egypt, Aden, and even over the Indian Ocean. The defense of Malta became a separate legend. Spare parts were always kept on the island for the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, which protected transport routes. When the carrier went north to Norway, about 12 naval versions, Sea Gladiators, remained at Califrana airfield. They were gathered together to have at least some air defense in case of an Italian attack. It was here that the story of faith, hope, and charity was born. The names of the 3 last aircraft that allegedly single-handedly withstood the full might of the Italian Regia Aeronautica. Undoubtedly, the pilots of these machines performed a feat, but the claim that they were the only defenders of the island is a myth. Post-war research showed that in the first 2 weeks, raids on the island were episodic, and only 3 Italian aircraft were shot down. Moreover, the fact that more modern Hurricanes appeared on Malta much earlier than is customarily believed in popular history is often forgotten. Perhaps the most interesting page in the history of this aircraft was the defense of Aden. 94 Fighter Squadron was based here under the command of Major Whiteman. In the first days of the war, when it seemed that the Italians were about to invade from East Africa, this unit acted extremely aggressively. It strafed enemy airfields, attacked warehouses, and covered ships. But the most impressive operation was conducted by Flight Lieutenant Haywood. Imagine, a real Italian submarine, the Galileo, surrendered to, and was subsequently captured by, a biplane pilot. Later, when the threat to Aden had passed, 94 Squadron was redeployed closer to the Suez Canal. It was planned that there the pilots would finally switch to modern Hurricanes. But fate decided otherwise. Major Whiteman and his men urgently flew to the aid of the RAF Habaniya base in Iraq, which in March 1941 was surrounded by an enemy army supported by Axis powers. And here the old Gladiator surprised everyone again. Despite the fact that the enemy used modern German aircraft, high-speed Bf-110s and He-111 bombers, the British biplanes accepted battle. Sergeants Smith and Dunwoody each destroyed 1 Messerschmitt, and Flight Lieutenant Hertage shot down a Heinkel. The last battle on a Gladiator in this campaign was fought by the commander himself, Major Whiteman. While covering a column marching on Baghdad, he shot down 2 Italian CR-42 biplanes. Having fulfilled its duty on June 1, 1941, the squadron returned to Ismailia and handed over its old machines to Allies. Gladiators were also active in the Western Desert from the very beginning of the war. 3 squadrons, 33, 80, and 112, accompanied British troops in Greece during the campaign against the Italians and Germans. Due to waterlogged airfields, there were few flights, right up to the final stages of the campaign. It was here that the legendary ace, Flight Lieutenant Paddle, made a name for himself again. Just a few months ago, he had fought successfully on a Gladiator in the desert, and now he demonstrated incredible skill in the skies of Greece. Probably the most famous battle took place over the Albanian border on February 28, 1941. Then 28 British fighters, a mixed group of Gladiators and Hurricanes, clashed in battle with an armada of 50 Italian aircraft. The result was stunning. No fewer than 27 enemy machines were destroyed or seriously damaged. Paddle personally shot down 5 aircraft in that battle. Unfortunately, 6 weeks later, he himself died in combat. With over 30 victories to his credit, achieved in just half a year, Paddle is rightfully considered one of the best Allied pilots of the Second World War. And without a doubt, he is the greatest of all who ever held the controls of a Gladiator. This aircraft and its naval version, the Sea Gladiator, fought on almost all fronts of the first 2 years of the war. In Finland, Norway, Belgium, France, England, Egypt, Libya, Greece, on Malta and Crete, in Iraq, Syria, and even in the skies of Latvia and Lithuania. There is evidence that these machines ended up even in the Soviet Union after the annexation of the Baltic republics. But over time, as Allied factories gathered momentum, the old veterans were transferred to secondary tasks, often in the most unexpected corners of the world. These biplanes served longest in meteorological flights, in North, West, and East Africa, in Iraq, on Gibraltar, and in Iceland. They flew at least until 1944. Only a few survived until the end of the war. Most aircraft, with the exception of those stuck in repair workshops, were sent for scrap. But the story had a beautiful continuation. A couple of surviving remains were bought by enthusiast V.H. Bellamy, who in 1952 managed to restore one example to flying condition. Assembled from the components of 2 different machines, this hybrid became the only living witness of the era. It remained a monument to Britain's most romantic biplane fighter, an aircraft that carried on its wings the best flying club in the world, in those times when the Royal Air Force was just learning to fly its formidable Hurricanes and Spitfires. That is the story of the Gloster Gladiator. Thank you for your attention and see you in new videos.